I'm currently writing a book called Moral Pressure for Responsible Globalization. It's a unique case study of what's being called the F8 and F20. These are faith leaders of world religions. The F8 is a group that has been meeting in shadow summits to the G8 political leaders around issues associated with fulfillment of the Millennium Development Goals when they existed. And then last year, it's evolved into the F20, which has been meeting as shadow summits to the G20 to now talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a new historic moment, a distinctively unique historic moment, where there are primarily human-induced global environmental changes occurring in the biosphere. And a key point of that is that everyone is implicated, and we're all in this together. This has created a particularly challenging governance situation because there is no global government. The inadequacies associated with the Westphalian nation-state system are particularly salient in this context, both in terms of the limitations of a nation-state framework's ability to respond to these global environmental changes, but also in terms of how the nation-state itself generates contributions to the problem itself. At the turn of the century, the international community came together to establish Millennium Development Goals, concrete, measurable, as a way of setting internationally agreed upon minimally morally acceptable standards for meeting the basic needs of human beings. As time progressed, it became clear that the ability to fulfill those goals was being significantly hampered by financial limitations, not because of having misjudged how much it would cost, but because it was primarily, the goals were primarily set based on financing from the G8, and they weren't delivering on those promises. Moreover, the limitations of a human-centered approach became increasingly apparent as data accumulated around a diverse array of primarily human-induced global environmental changes, whether it's deforestation, pollution accumulation, ozone depletion, the list goes on. Leaders of the world's religions were becoming increasingly concerned about this state of affairs, and in 2005, leaders of the world's religions from the G8 countries began meeting in parallel transnational shadow summits to pressure the G8 world leaders to deliver on the promises that they had made to finance the Millennium Development Goals. They primarily worked with governmental Sherpas and deputy foreign ministers as a way of gaining access where they could to prime ministers and presidents. The F8 leaders developed statements, they engaged in media campaigns, as well as lobbied with their own religious constituencies to address the issues that they took up in each context. And there were variations on a theme, often centering around the Millennium Development Goals, and then adapted to the local context concerns and events that had happened internationally, whether it was the earthquake in Italy, or depending what the context was. The process continued for 9 years, then began to wane as the Millennium Development Goal of 2015 drew closer, and it became clear that they weren't going to meet the goals. And no one knew what would happen when the deadline was up. Would there even be something else to take its place? Simultaneously, halfway around the world in Australia, in 2014, leaders of world religions from the G20 countries began to gather, meeting in shadow G20 summits to dialogue with one another, to encourage G20 world leaders to adopt a new set of goals to replace the Millennium Development Goals when they expired in 2015. This group primarily accessed political leaders through political appointees for religious freedom, where they exist. They're not in existence in all of the G20 countries. They also heavily emphasized the law and legal developments for the protection of both human rights and the rights of religious minorities. There was overlap in the religious leaders that attended both meetings, and in 2015, after adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals by the global community, the F8 and F20 processes evolved into a single ongoing effort to continue moral pressure for responsible globalization. This is what I'm writing about. I use the method of individualizing comparisons. It's a comparative historical method. It uses data to make empirically informed judgments about the theoretical developments that are going on in what Beck has theorized as world risk society. The data that I'm using functions as evidence to make knowledgeable decisions about whether to continue with his theory as it is, to reformulate it, or reinterpret it. Although I have more than 130 interviews, I have media publications to draw upon, I've got surveys of attendees from a few years to draw upon, I'm keenly aware that I am dealing with a sample size of 1. You can't generalize when you have a sample size of 1. I pay careful attention to ground any abstracted historical concepts that I develop in both time and space, to root my description in genuine historic structures and processes, and to be careful not to overgeneralize or exaggerate any sense of human agency that might be associated with the process. That said, when I was part of the anti-apartheid movement, when it was in high gear, I clearly remember how much people underestimated the possible influence that economic sanctions and moral pressure from the international faith-based network of world religions might make. Those of a more materialist bent insisted a bloodbath would be inevitable. And that's not what happened, though many lives were lost.